June 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. The air smells of burnt oil and salt. Soldiers march across the soot-covered deck. On the horizon, wreckage still smolders, echoes of the Japanese attack months earlier. Amid the chaos, a group of Navy officers watches a torpedo being lifted from a crane. A civil engineer, his face smeared with grease and his eyes weary, observes in silence. The admiral lets out a dry laugh. This is what's going to defeat the Japanese Empire? It looks more like a drainpipe than a weapon. The group laughs. The engineer doesn't. He knows what's inside that metallic body. Sensors, mechanisms, and calculations that defy the very physics of the underwater world. But nobody believes him. The torpedo falls into the water for testing and fails. The admiral turns his back. Another failure. Go back to basics. The engineer watches the foam dissipate. Deep down, he knows warfare has changed. Only the Navy hasn't realized it yet. What they didn't know was that on that day, they were witnessing the beginning of their own end. The story begins years earlier in 1931. While the world recovered from the Great Depression, the United States was preparing quietly for a war that did not yet have a name. At the Bureau of Ordnance, a new project comes to life. The Mark 14 torpedo, theoretically the most advanced in the world. It had everything engineers dreamed of: a closed-cycle engine powered by compressed air and kerosene, a magnetic detonation system capable of exploding beneath the enemy's hull without even touching it, and an aerodynamic body that promised unprecedented range and precision. It was, not paper, a magic bullet across 2 seas. But there was a problem: the economy. The Navy in peacetime viewed the project as excessive luxury. Tests were rare, expensive, and often simulated with inert torpedoes. The engineers were asking for real-world tests. The Navy said there's no budget. Even so, they persisted. The chief engineer, William Bill Blandy, championed the project as if it were his own child. "One day you will understand," he said. "This torpedo will change the course of a war that hasn't even started yet." But when the prototype was unveiled, laughter came before the glory. It was heavy, unstable, and far too complex for the submarines of that era. During the first launches, it would either dive too deep or never resurface. No one imagined that this apparent failure carried the seeds of victory. 10 years later, the world was burning. Pearl Harbor was bleeding. The Pacific was Japanese territory, and the American submarines, finally at war, received direct orders: attack, destroy the enemy. But there was a tragic detail. Their main weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was still the same one from the failed tests. No revisions, no adjustments, no real testing. In January 1942, the submarine USS Seawolf fired its first torpedoes against a Japanese cargo ship. Everyone misses the target. "A mistaken aim," say the officers. "New shot fired, direct impact and nothing. No explosion." Official reports describe the scene as follows: the torpedo impacted and ricocheted. Possible fuse failure. It flies like a brick, useless in combat. Within a few months, dozens of submarines reported the same problem: torpedoes that explode prematurely or never explode at all. Commanders are sometimes brought to tears of rage when they see enemy ships escaping unscathed. The Japanese enemy, in turn, is proud. "The sea has chosen its side," said an officer of the Imperial Navy. And for the time being, it seemed that he was right. But the sea has its secrets. In 1943, after months of frustration, a young commander, Charles Swede Mommsen, a specialist in diving and underwater rescue, decided to challenge the Bureau of Ordnance. He doesn't accept the official narrative. It's not the submarines, it's not the men, it's the torpedoes. Without authorization, Mommsen conducts secret tests in the Philippines. He disassembles an entire Mark 14 piece by piece, like a surgeon. Then he discovers the impossible. The torpedo was diving 3 meters deeper than the indicator showed. The magnetic detonator failed in shallow seas, and the impact primer was too weak to withstand the shock. Mommsen sends a report directly to Washington. "Our torpedoes aren't working. We're fighting with blind weapons." The response from High Command is cold, unfounded. Trust the engineering. But submariners no longer trust them. They themselves begin to modify their torpedoes manually, disabling the magnetic sensors and adjusting the depth gauges with improvised tricks. Then in July 1943, the USS Tinosa fired on the Japanese oil tanker Tonan Maru No. 3, a gigantic immobile target. 11 torpedoes. 10 fail. The last one, modified with Mommsen's alterations, explodes beneath the hull and splits the ship in two. Silence in command. The truth could no longer be ignored. The failure had been human, not mechanical. The Navy finally orders, "Inspect all torpedoes, fix the Mark 14. The monster awakens. What happens next becomes part of the underwater folklore of the war. From 1944 onward, the new Mark 14s, corrected, recalibrated, rigorously tested, transformed every American submarine into an invisible beast. Reports of attacks become nightmares for the enemy. 4 torpedoes fired, all hit. Ship broke in two, no survivors. The Japanese, who once laughed at the American blind gun, now call it Kaminari no Hebi, the Thunder Serpent. The rhythmic roar of the submarine engines mingled with the deep sound of explosions, thunder that emanated from the depths of the sea. Deck after deck, train after train, the empire of the rising sun begins to bleed. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 60% of the Japanese merchant fleet was destroyed. Warships disappear without warning. Fear corrodes even the most disciplined imperial sailors. A Japanese prisoner would later recount, "There was no warning, just silence, and then thunder. The sea swallowed us." The same sound that once provoked laughter, now it was the sound of ruin. The impact of the Mark 14 goes beyond statistics. He changes the doctrine of submarine warfare. Previously, submarines were seen as auxiliary weapons, scouts, explorers, sabotage tools. After the Mark 14, they become strategic weapons, capable of isolating entire nations. The learning process is brutal but definitive. The U.S. Navy creates new testing divisions, establishes engineering protocols, and for the first time in history, acknowledges, without studying flaws, there is no progress. The engineers who were once ridiculed are now silent heroes. Blandy, the man who once heard laughter when presenting his torpedo, is recalled to Washington. He doesn't talk much. Just look at the reports. 4,000 torpedoes launched, 1,800 hits confirmed. A weapon once rejected, now revered. But the price? 2 years of defeats, lives lost, and trust destroyed. The lesson, however, remains. Arrogance kills more than the enemy. August 1945. The war ends. In Japanese ports, wrecked ships are still smoking. At American bases, submarines return covered in rust, but victorious. A reporter asks a veteran commander, "What changed the tide of war in the Pacific?" He replies without hesitation, "The weapon the Navy didn't want." And he smiled bitterly, because he knows the price of ignorance. Those who once laughed at the torpedo, calling it useless and defective, now lay flowers on the graves of sailors who fought with it to the end. They laughed when they saw her for the first time. They stopped laughing when they realized that the sound of their laughter was mixed with the thunder of defeat. The thunder spoke, and the sea never belonged to them again. The Mark 14 was more than just a weapon. It was a reflection of what war does to human pride. He showed that technology without humility is useless, and that innovation without courage is mere vanity. In the modern era, where every mistake is punished with missile speed, the lesson of the Mark 14 still resonates. There is no victory without admitting mistakes, because sometimes the weapon that is rejected is the one that saves the world.